Meister Eckhart's sermon number 2 is about sex. Let's just come right out and say it. That actually drives me crazy when people try and dance around this or pretend that something doesn't exist, but that's clearly what's going on here. He's talking about virginity. He's going to talk about external works, which, by the way, include any kind of physical commitment to chastity, and then going beyond that and extolling the fruitful and virtuous nature of the wife. In other words, the active life. And when we're talking about activity here, we are talking about sexual activity, and he does this throughout the sermon. So let's just get this, let's just get that out there. Now, he begins this sermon by saying, I've spoken a few words first that are in Latin that are written in the gospel, and then he translates it and says, our Lord Jesus Christ went up into a little castle and was received by a virgin who was a wife. Now, Luke 10:38, okay, it doesn't really quite say this, but Eckhart frequently changes things when it comes to biblical interpretation. And so his form of exegesis is such that he's not shy about changing things when it productively suits his needs. And that's what's going on here. That was actually more of a commonplace back then than it is now. They were less conservative in that way than people tend to be today. So what we have here and what his audience would have noticed is that there's a contradiction right up front. A virgin who is a wife, to be a wife is not to be a virgin. And so we should understand the difference between a maid, someone who is virginly, and someone who is a wife, someone who is not. We're directly talking about sex and children here. And so make no mistake about what's going on. Now, that being said, so he goes on and says, listen carefully. It must from necessity be that the person who received Jesus was a virgin. In other words, the person who has the capacity to receive the divine. So to have the capacity to receive the divine, one must be virginal in a certain sense. And this sense is one where you are, as he says, a person is rightly spoken of as a virgin if he is free of all foreign images, as free as he was when he was not. Okay, well, the second part of that sentence is really bizarre and really interesting, and we'll get to that. But the person who received Jesus was a virgin, and that means to be free of foreign images. So an image is a technical term for Eckhart. And an image is specifically something that is kind of like a concept. So any kind of abstraction or coloration in terms of a mentally specific artifact. So something that we have that is a particular conception of something, a particular literally an image of something, an idea of something, and so on. And we should remember at this point, and I use the word idea not coincidentally, because Eckhart was a Neoplatonist. He was a Neoplatonic mystic. And the Neoplatonists, going back to Plato, they're very concerned with the forms. The forms are the ideas, eidos. And so what we should understand here when we hear about foreign images are any of the forms, any of the ideas, any abstract conception that clutters the mind that is below God. And so Plato's hierarchy is such that at the top, you have the good, and the good is the father of all of the other forms. He actually says this in the Republic, and the other forms are children of the good. So this is Plato, and this gets adopted, of course, by Christianity and with the early church fathers, who were, to a man, basically all Platonists. So they were very strongly Platonic, and we shouldn't be surprised that this is the case, including, by the way, St. Augustine. St. Augustine, of course, was Meister Eckhart's favorite. He quotes Augustine more than he quotes anyone else. And so this is Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, around 400 AD. So he says, free of all foreign images. And so anything that is below God, anything that is below the good, is going to be in some sense an image that is foreign, that is strange, fremda, so that is strange to God. And so anything that is outside of God is going to by necessity then be somewhat foreign to him, alien to him, strange to him. The word can be translated in all these different ways. In other words, it is not at home with God. It is not really appropriate to God. It is something that is at a distance from God. And that's what he has in mind here. Now, the second part of that sentence is a doozy. As free as he was when he was not. So this is freedom referring to a time when we were not, which is, of course, a direct contradiction, right? Eckhart loves paradox, and this is one of them. I mean, we began with the virgin wife, and now we're off to this. So what was it like to be me before I existed? That's what he's talking about here. And so there is a freedom to being me, to being before I existed. Well, okay, being for Eckhart is God's being. So God's being is everything's being, and that is ultimately the divine ground out of which we all come, which means that any notion of the individual, any conception of the individual and what we know of ourselves and the way that we think of ourselves is necessarily going to be tied up with God's being. It could not do otherwise. For it to do anything at all, it has to be within God's being. And so we're never really at a distance from God. It's only in adoption of strange images, in adoption of foreign ideas, in adoption of anything that is at a distance from God that clutters the mind. That's where we become specifically not able to receive God. And in this way, with this particular shade of the metaphor, not virginal. And so that's what's going on in the early going. Now, he immediately says, okay, well, people are going to be confused about this. So people can ask, one may ask, how a person who is born and proceeds in rational life can also be free of all of his images as he was not. He knows many things, after all, which are images. How does that work? How can you be free? And that seems very natural, right? I mean, if we're going to live, in other words, if we were going to live at all, if we're going to do anything in the world, then some sense of differentiation, some sense of distinction must prevail over what it is that we think about. Otherwise, how would you even be able to put on your socks in the morning and do anything? If you don't see distinction in anything and all is just divine oneness, all is divine being, then you are at a state of rest, but that state of rest doesn't necessarily conduce to being able to get around in the world. And Eckhart recognizes this right up front and wants to nip that in the bud. And he says, now take note of an explanation which will help you to understand, but this explanation is not easy. So he says, if I were so rational that all rational images were in me, that all people had ever received, and all those that were in God with himself, and I were without attachment. So that's key. And I were without attachment, having not grasped, so clinging. This is the metaphor here. If I was not clinging with attachment to any activity or leaving anything undone. So this is in actively doing something and pursuing desires, or anxiety and thinking about doing something, without looking to past or future. So past or future, this is actually kind of important. So past, of course, is the circumstance of regret. So that's the area of regret. When we think about the past, typically, if we have anxiety about the past, it's in the form of regret. In the future, it's worry. And so without thought of past or future, and so that's going to be a running theme here, is in the present and eternal now. Then he says, I would stand free and unhindered in the present moment. Stand, of course, referring to rest. And so that's his metaphorics for rest. And so the word for stand in Eckhart's vocabulary is associated frequently with rest. And so we should understand a place of standing to be one of rest, where you are not moving. And so I would stand free and unhindered in the present moment, in God's dearest will and uninterrupted doing. And in truth, then I would be a virgin. Okay, so virgin now is associated with divine rest. It's associated with being unhindered by images in this state of divine and perfect rest. Now, in this first part of the sermon, Eckhart frequently describes effectively a mystical itinerary, a spiritual progression, in other words. So an itinerary, like I'm going to do this first and do this next and do this next. And he describes a progression that we should go through to arrive at where it is that he ultimately wants to go. Now, what can be terrifying about that is that means that the first part of the sermon is the easy part. So wherever he begins, he's going to begin close to common sense, common conceptions and whatnot, which is, by the way, also what Plato does, and why it is that we're talking about sex, and why it is that he's talking about physical beauty, and specifically in talking about sexuality. He begins where people are, ministers to them where they are, and then moves beyond that and goes in a different direction. So I think that's kind of interesting. Now, the question is, another question arises at this point. If I was in your average dinner table conversation, and I was trying to make a prosaic example about something, different sized objects, or something that's just utterly uninteresting, and to make that point, I use the example of politics, something inflammatory, Democratic versus Republican or something, whatever it is. I don't know. I'm not in politics, but I don't really care very much about that. I'm more monastic. But if I was to do something like that, then people might rightly say it's, okay, I understand your point, but man, I would have used a different example. That example is unnecessarily incendiary. That's going to get people riled up. And we're inclined to ask the same question here with Eckhart. Why use the example of sex if you're not going to use it? In other words, when people look at this sermon and they pretend that sex has nothing to do with it and say that, this is just, Eckhart is talking about spiritual purity and he's talking about the return to God and being virginal. And when he says action, he's talking about divine action. He's not talking about copulation. No, he's actually talking about copulation. And he's doing this intentionally because otherwise, why in the world would you use that example? And so he's no fool. He's doing this in very much the same way that Plato did. So Plato mentions the ascent to the good, and the ascent to the good is by way of the vehicle of beauty. And so this is understood in terms of basically the Holy Spirit for Plato. So this is his vehicle, the thing that carries you up via some notion of either grace or otherwise not necessarily personal intention, where we have to be involved with, something about the catalytic effect of getting beauty in from the outside world. So it's not a motion that we can accomplish ourselves. In other words, you're not going to be able to sit in a dark room like Descartes did and just, do your own contemplation and get there yourself. For Plato, it's okay, being out in the world and actually seeing things and beginning where you are. In other words, for Plato, beginning with physical beauty. And he specifically says physical bodies. So Plato doesn't mess around with this either. And Eckhart is doing the same kind of thing. So he's not just talking about physical beauty like a beautiful still life or a painting or something. No, he's talking about sexuality. He's talking about beautiful bodies. And then moving on from there, he says that's where you have to start because that's probably where you are. And then we move from there. And this, by the way, is the next step. That's productive. And Eckhart is doing the same kind of thing in saying, look, this is probably where you are. And if you're beginning with commonplace desires, and commonplace desires include sexuality, otherwise we wouldn't get very far as a species. And so, that's where people are. And so I think that's what's going on here. That's why he mentions it in the context of what is otherwise a sermon about spiritual purity and the, attributes of and the virtues of contemplation versus activity. Because that's ultimately the big thing that he has here. And to kind of come full circle, this is the spiritual progression he's talking about. He's talking about the contemplative life, the path of contemplation, via contemplativa, versus the active life, via activa. And so he's talking about the life of contemplation versus the life of action. And this is kind of a commonplace going back years and years, not only in Christian history, but in general in spiritual history, where people question, okay, should I just become a monk, swear off everything in the world and go live in the woods or the mountains alone somewhere and just be with my thoughts and then try and get to the divine that way? Or am I either better off, or is it even possible for me to do this as a householder, for me to do this out in the world? And I say householder in thinking of someone who is not only someone who owns a house, who keeps a house, and who has a family, who has a job and other things. And I mean, this is somebody who's very much in the world. And in Buddhism, this was something that was current at the time of Christ. So around the time of Christ, we start hearing about stories of Vimalakirti, who is the householder who is able to nonetheless achieve enlightenment. And this is the tradition out of which we get Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana, of course, not only including the form that was extant at that time in India, but also later what would become Chan in China, and then Zen, most famously for us here in the United States, in the West, in Japan. And so Zen grows out of this notion that, yes, you can do it actively in the world. There's nothing special about just being a monk, but it makes it easier. And so one is inclined to say that, Eckhart is probably of a mind with this. Okay, so that being said, let's continue on. So he goes on to say that being a virgin doesn't take anything from someone. It doesn't take anything from your works and anything that you've ever done. You remain virginal and free without any hindrance, as the unhindered and free Jesus is maidenly in himself. As the masters once say, oneness is through likeness and likeness alone. Well, now that's interesting in the sense that, are we talking about a recapturing of virginity? That's a real issue. And that has been a real issue where people talk about this. Is it possible to get back to a state of spiritual purity? Because that's ultimately what people mean by virginity. And talking about sexual purity is like, there is some sort of purity associated with this state. And even if you were sullied with it later by actually having sex, can you get back to that state? And that might seem a contradiction in terms to us, but paradox is nowhere unfamiliar to Eckhart and what it is that he's talking about. And so, especially in the very beginning here, being a virgin doesn't take anything from you, specifically that it doesn't take anything from your works. It doesn't change any of your works. In other words, it is possible to be a virgin and still be active. And he's going to go on. He's building up to saying it's possible to be a virgin and also be a wife. In other words, it is possible to be a virgin and then still having had sex. And so that's ultimately what's being done here. Again, I think we lose something by dancing around this. I think we lose something by not just coming out and saying that that's what's going on. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. And so he goes on, if there was any kind of, lack of clarity here. Okay, now listen, mark well, listen carefully. For now, if a man always remained a virgin, no fruit would come from him. To be fruitful, you have to be a wife. And then he says, wife is the noblest word that one can say of the soul, much nobler than virgin. Okay, so now he's starting to put a stake in the sand and say the active life. This is where it's at. Some sense of being involved in the world and being active, that is better than being contemplative. And so being contemplative is useful. He talks about this and, for the first page of this, it's really not even that, the first few paragraphs. Yeah, it's useful to be in the contemplative mode, but ultimately we must be productive. And this is, we should think of, especially in Zen and in Mahayana Buddhism, the notion of the bodhisattva, the one who achieves some kind of enlightenment and then goes back out into the world among people and to, help to raise all sentient beings to that. And so that seems to be, the direction that he's driving here. So he says, for a man to receive God in himself, that is good. In the receptivity, he is a virgin. So in other words, to have the capacity to receive God, one must be a virgin in that sense. But God becomes fruitful in him, that is better. In other words, God is active. And God is, even in unity, even in divine unity, which is associated with rest, there is still the divine activity. There is still the word. And so there is this contradiction that goes all the way back in Christianity. You have divine rest and divine unity, divine oneness, and you also have the act of creation of the word, and the word that is being spoken ceaselessly. In other words, the eternal birth of the word in the soul, the eternal birth of the word in creation, and in creating the world at every moment. And so there is a paradox at the heart of Christianity that is just the same here. And Eckhart is saying, look, you've got that inside of the soul as well. So you have the paradox both of being passive and having the capacity to receive God in contemplation, in stillness, in silence, in rest, and then also in action. And action, of course, being understood here, and he stirred his listeners up to it in thinking specifically of the action of sex. So that's what lays in the background here. Okay. And he says the only gratitude for a gift is to be fruitful with it. Well, now that's interesting as well, because he's famous for saying that if the only prayer that you ever say to God is thank you, then that will be enough. In other words, the mode of gratitude, the mode of just kind of basking in God's glory and in the divine oneness in saying, thank you. That is the sense of prayer for Eckhart, not a propitiatory prayer. And as he says in Sermon 1 specifically, not a prayer that engages in any kind of mercantile bartering relationship of buying and selling. In other words, where we're actually trying to get something from God and saying, okay, well, if I'm good and I do these things or I make temples or do other things for you, you'll do some stuff for me. And that is specifically what Eckhart has a problem with and comes down very hard in saying that that's not how we should do things. Okay. So he says then that the gratitude for that gift is to be fruitful. Well, to be fruitful in this way specifically is to have the action with God. In other words, to be active with God in speaking the word, in giving birth to the word. And so that's ultimately the what he has in mind here. Many great gifts are received in virginity and are not born back again into God. In other words, people receive, but they don't necessarily give it out to others. And that's kind of a loss. Like there's more that could be done. He's saying it is better to be able to give it back to others. Now, there is a notion in the Dominican order there's a tradition in the Dominican order that is specifically related to this. And the the tradition is to give the gifts that were given to you in contemplation to others, to help to lead others and give to others the gifts that have been given to you in contemplation. And so in this way, Eckhart is being thoroughly Dominican and saying that there's already essentially a form of the bodhisattva, a form of the person who has won certain favors and gifts in contemplation, and then will go out and, give those to others and minister to others. So that's already a tradition for the Dominicans. This isn't just Eckhart. But to associate that specifically with a kind of wifely fruitfulness and, engage in the divine activity and both in bringing in sex, which is already kind of, wow, what is he doing? And then also in the divine activity and speaking the word, that's a little bit more than we get frequently when we think about just trying to bring good things from, the contemplation and meditation hall out to your average person that you're ministering to. So, okay. And he says, the gifts all spoil and come to nothing. In other words, it's like a fruit that you've gotten, but then you don't give it to anyone else. And so it just rots. And so he's very clear that this needs to be given. It needs to be given out, and that the virginity is itself not useful unless you then become a wife. In other words, don't remain a virgin, become a wife, go out in this sexual activity. I mean, he's literally associating sexual activity and speaking of it in terms of speaking the word. And so this is all the way from the most base level in terms of what Plato recommends all the way up to the good. And Eckhart is uniting these things in a very provocative way in this sermon. That may be one of the reasons that it's very famous. Because it uses such a lively image. I mean, if he were to use something other than sex and say that it was, I don't know, the creating of a wooden spoon, and I'm thinking of Nicholas of Cusa here in particular, people just don't think about spoons in the same way. I mean, it's just not as interesting. And so now that, of course, was not what Cusanus was doing. That's actually an example of being able to create new things. But anyway, we'll talk about that at some point. Okay. So he goes on to say, okay, yeah, great. Now let's find the limits here of sexuality. Married people bring forth little more than one fruit in a year. Well, 9 months, so little more than one fruit in a year. So if you're constantly bearing children, little more than one child in a year. And he says, but now I mean other married people, those that are bound with attachment to prayer, fasting, vigils, and all kinds of exterior exercises and mortification. Okay, exterior exercises and mortification. What is he talking about here? He's talking about chastity. He's not just talking about prayer. Now, prayer, of course, also the propitiatory kind, as I mentioned before, he's speaking against that. Fasting, yes. Vigils, any kind of ritual, yes. Okay, those are all good things according to Eckhart, but they are limited in certain ways insofar as you have attachment to those external exercises. As he says here, if you are bound with attachment to prayer, bound with attachment to all kinds of exterior exercises and mortification. In other words, if you are attached to chastity, let that kind of wash over you for a minute, right? If you are attached to chastity, it will be useless to you. Now, this is where this has to lay in the background. He's not just going to come out and say it necessarily, but it's incredibly provocative to say we're going to link just a couple of things that are connected here by, paragraphs. They're not separated hardly at all. And to notice that Eckhart is speaking against all forms of external mortification, of which chastity has to be considered a kind of external mortification because it is a denial of desire, a denial of the body. And so in that way, it is very much like fasting. And so we should understand then fasting maybe even to have been mentioned in this context, where fasting, you are denying yourself. You're denying yourself specifically something that you desire frequently. And then it's the same thing. It's the same thing over and over again. And so I think this is very much what he wants us to get out of this work, which is really interesting. And I think even more provocative than the way that it's typically talked about. Any attachment to any work takes away from the freedom to attend to God in this present now. Okay, so if there was any question to this whatsoever, in other words, he's saying that the attachment to chastity, the attachment to fasting, the attachment to prayer, propitiatory prayer especially, that keeps you at a distance from God. And he got in trouble for this, actually, in saying that you're praying badly if you're praying for something. He got in trouble for that. He actually didn't get in trouble for this, which is kind of interesting. So that's fairly plain. And Eckhart has a habit of doing this. It's like, is he really saying that? And then he comes up, in the next sentence and the next couple of sentences in the next paragraph, and then just hammers the point home, saying in as extreme a form as he possibly can. So yeah, he's obviously saying that. So anyway, okay. So let's see. Renewed and free in every present moment, as if you did not possess desire or even could do anything else. And so he wants to emphasize just how complete, how comprehensive this being with God is, and this sense of being one with God, being cleared of all of these hindrances, all of these disturbances, anything that can trouble you and can clutter your mind. So images that clutter your mind, we began with that. Images that clutter your mind. Everybody saw, okay, that's the kind of easy form of this. Moving on to external forms of fasting and ritual and prayer and chastity. And okay, that's other things that can get in the way. And then now moving forward and saying, okay, well, man, where's he going to go beyond this? But it gets better. So he talked about married people, actual married people who are bearing more than, one fruit a year, but little more than that. But we can do better than this in bearing many fruits a year. So he says, for your soul to bring forth no fruit, if it has not done work that possessed you. Your soul brings forth no fruit if it has not done that work that possessed you with attachment, having neither trust in God nor yourself, unless you accomplish the work you've grasped with attachment. Otherwise, you have no peace. So again, this is he'll circle it and then he'll circle it again and say it again. And attachment is the problem. Detachment is the solution, which is why he says this is the highest virtue. And so, Eckhart is famous for this sort of thing. Again, Sermon 52. So if you're not familiar with that one, that is a great place to start for his work specifically on detachment, because the third portion of Sermon 52, where he goes beyond knowing and loving, loving, willing, and knowing to detachment. That's the order. So going beyond the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and then finally to detachment, which is Eckhart. That's what's meant here. And so he says, I call these people married, for they remain bound to attachment. In other words, if you're still in the world and you're still involved in this, then you're going to bring forth a little bit of fruit, but it's small. And so this is where it's like, okay, now we've hammered the point home with sexuality. Let's go beyond this. So any kind of physical sense of sexuality can only be so productive. Plato would like this, I think, in that it provides a very obvious metaphor for why it is that we can't just stay with the beauty of physical bodies, and we must move beyond them and ascend up towards, ultimately for Plato, mathematics, and then the other abstractions and the forms, and then up to the good. So Eckhart actually, by the way, does say something about mathematics, and we'll talk about that at some point. He does do a lot with mathematical metaphors and prepares the ground for Nicholas of Cusanus's famous mathematical metaphors a century or so later. But anyway, that's not particularly here. So he says, a virgin who's a wife is free and unbound without attachment. So in other words, this paradoxical situation of being both virginal and as a wife, in other words, having not participated in sexuality, having participated in sexuality, then one who is free and unbound without attachment. That's the paradox. So that's the sense of which you can be both without attachment, being equally near God and herself at all times. And so again, this is outside of time, outside of any kind of temporality, outside of any kind of corporeality. That's ultimately what's referred to here, is kind of going beyond that. And in going beyond that and uniting with God, then you are in a sense both virgin, having the capacity for God, and then wife, being the co-worker with God, acting the divine work. In other words, speaking the word, giving birth ceaselessly to the word, in time, outside of time, in all of the various paradoxes. And so in that way, he says, she brings forth many fruits, and these are great, neither less nor more than God himself is. Well, that makes sense. So in other words, the fruit is God. So the fruit that you were giving birth to as a virgin wife is God. And that may be surprising, but it really shouldn't be, right? Because the only possible divine activity is God. God does God. God is the activity of God. And so the speaking of the word is comprehensive. It is not a thing that proceeds, now it's going to be this, now it's going to be this in time. It's not something that changes, because change is ultimately alien to the sense of divine oneness in God. And so it must be all of God everywhere, all at once, even in the smallest bit. And that's a notion called intensive infinity. In other words, that God is present. The entirety of God is present in the smallest bit, the smallest mote of reality, which is why he uses elsewhere the fly or the moth or something just totally inconsequential and prosaic. The tiniest bit of reality contains all of God. And this is, I like to point out, analogous to Dogen's moon in a dewdrop. So Dogen was one of the founders of a school in Zen in Japan around this same time, by the way, living around the same time that Eckhart did, but thousands of miles away. That's interesting that they're doing almost the same thing in that way. So let's move on. We'll talk about Eckhart and Zen at another time. So the virgin who is a wife makes this fruit and gives birth to it, bringing forth every day 100 or 1,000 fruits, even without number. Well, it has to be without number, right? Because it's outside of time, in eternity. The ceaseless birth of the Word is utterly infinite, compactly and intensely infinite. And so for those of you who are in mathematics, you might appreciate this. It is not countably infinite. It is not uncountably infinite. It is entirely beyond any sense of a limited notion of infinity. So an infinity for which there can be no greater. And so we're kind of reminded of St. Anselm in this way, right? This is a very interesting way of understanding that. And also bringing in some kind of mathematical concepts that, by the way, were not developed yet, but we're going to see the seeds laid for that in the not too terribly distant future after Eckhart. So with cardinalities of infinity and that sort of thing. So that's, I mean, we have to wait a few centuries before we get any of that explicitly, but the groundwork for that in thinking through different forms of infinity is starting to be done around this time. And we're really going to see it in, the following century. So in the 15th century. Okay. So that being said, I suspect that was probably surprising. If you're not familiar with Eckhart and the history of infinity and that sort of thing here, that does lay in the background for his discussion of divine infinity. Okay. So to say it even better, yes, out of that same ground, the Father is giving birth to his eternal word. So in other words, if there was any ambiguity, and I wasn't just making things up when I was saying this earlier, the divine activity is the eternal word. He's doing that forever and always at each eternal now, which of course can be, must be outside of a temporality and must be outside of number. So it must be ceaseless and without number. And so there, fruitfully, she gives birth with him. So in other words, she is a mitteworker. And this is something that I've addressed elsewhere. And he says elsewhere in different sermons where we are co-workers with God, famously co-workers with God. And by the way, this occurs in sermons where he's also talking about some of the same kind of things. So there's another Martha and Mary sermon. This is one of them. Martha and Mary are the two poles of the active versus the contemplative life. And so Mary is thought of as the contemplative, the one who is, with Christ and still and quiet, whereas Martha is, roaming around doing things in the world. And typically the way of speaking about that is that Mary is the superior one because she is contemplative and still with Christ, whereas Martha is active and somehow still missing something because she hasn't, gotten the point yet. Eckhart turns that on its head and says Martha's the one who's doing better because she is actively involved in the world. In other words, she's already seen it, has already been with Christ, and now knows to spread that and to be in the world with everything and be a co-worker with this divine creation, the speaking of the word ceaselessly outside of time. So that's ultimately what he's going to do with that, which kind of turns that normal trope of Martha and Mary, the contemplative and the active, it turns it on its head. Okay, so he goes on to say, she radiates and shines with him as one single one. This was a difficult thing to translate. Ein einig ein. So he is one, one, oneness, one. His audience would have heard that very clearly. It would have stood out to them just because of the, repetitive nature of it. A pure and clear light in the fatherly heart. Okay, so again, hopefully you'll see there's really no ambiguity here. So I'm not guessing with these interpretations. And Eckhart is going to say these things over and over and over again. Then he goes on. He says, I've said more, so this isn't enough. In other words, we're not to the end. It's not enough that we're ceaselessly speaking the word in the soul. That's not enough. There's more that can be said. And these are really difficult pieces. Like, I just can't imagine someone actually getting up and giving this as a sermon. Most sermons are much more prosaic than this. They don't even get out of the first paragraph of Eckhart. By the time we get out of the first paragraph with Eckhart, he's already done some, amazingly provocative and surprising things. Rhetoric that shocks us with the, virgin wife and talking about all of this. I mean, he does this very early on, but then going further, I mean, it really gets kind of theologically, spiritually intense. And that's what happens here. And this paragraph is notoriously difficult. He says, so I've gone beyond in saying there is a power in the soul which touches neither time nor flesh. Okay, so this is the uncreated spark. This is something that Eckhart has gotten in trouble for, and it's because, and it was mentioned in the bull in Agro Domenico, in part because, as I've argued in my book, Paradox at Play, so I am one of Meister Eckhart's translators. I've translated a lot of his works, published this work in 2023. A lot of the material that had yet been unpublished in English through Catholic University of America Press. And so that's out there now. That's actually where I'm drawing this. I'm, working through and reading my own translation of this work, which is inside of that book. And anyway, okay, so the spark relates specifically to the individual. He got in trouble with it because of the rhetoric of the individual. And that's ultimately what's at stake here, is that he's talking about the persistence of individual identity all the way up to the good, all the way up to God. And that's where Eckhart's rhetoric sounds new and rare, new and unusual. So this is nova et rara. So this is actually what he says in the Latin, where, he knows his works and self-consciously is trying to make his words sound new and unusual for the purpose of being able to minister to people and to help them and to elicit a kind of spiritual progress that will be productive for them. So he's doing this very intentionally and then over and over again, as if there were any, if he wasn't doing it intentionally, you might expect to see it once, like a glancing blow. You just accidentally run into the curb. But when somebody runs into the curb and drives on the sidewalk for a while, you can probably be fairly safe to say that they intended to do that. That's the kind of thing here. Eckhart is driving on the sidewalk, and that's it's a metaphor that he couldn't possibly have used, but I think it's appropriately vivid. So anyway, so he goes on, the spark, the individual, this is something that is uncreated, in associating the soul, which is specifically temporal and created, with that which is uncreated, was seen as radical and potentially problematic. And it was seen as potentially problematic in the bull. And so the papal bull in Agro Domenico that was issued in 1329, a year after Eckhart died, was to censor some of the things that he was supposed to have said. And I'm not making that phrasing up. That's what John Paul II, the Pope in 1992, said, that Eckhart was not censored himself. It was only some things that he was supposed to have said. And we'll talk about this later, but because the bull itself is very interesting. There were a lot of wins in there for Eckhart. And there was a thought that Henry of Werneberg and the others that were associated with this trial, that the Pope needed an ally in that area. And so because of that, he was going to continue with this, because normally inquisitorial proceedings are dropped when someone dies. Because if it only pertains to that individual, then there's no point in continuing to prosecute an individual who's dead. But after Eckhart died, this continued on. And the bull was issued. So presumably it was issued for reasons that had nothing to do with Eckhart. And we find this, by the way, in, for instance, there's a Mainz inquisitor who had this, in other words, an inquisitor in Mainz, who had this work in Agro Domenico in his folio. And so it seems reasonable to think that, anyway, that was what was going on. And they say specifically in the bull that they are concerned with inspiring doubt in the minds of the uneducated. So, in other words, it's not that there's theologically anything wrong with what Eckhart's doing. And Pope John Paul II said, Eckhart you may consider him a perfectly orthodox theologian. So the theology is not actually the problem. So in other words, what he's saying here is not actually unorthodox. It's not actually the problem. The problem was the way in which it was presented. He was afraid in the vernacular, which was unusual at that time, preaching in the vernacular. He was afraid that would lead people astray. That's effectively what that is, which is a really, really mild thing compared to the reputation that Eckhart frequently has as, he was, brought up on charges by the Inquisition, Eckhart the heretic. No, it's nothing like that. It was much, much milder than that, where there were some things that they were worried that because they were in German, because they were in the vernacular, that people who were not educated would have access to it, and that might be a problem. So anyway, that's what's going on with the spark. That's what he's referring to here is the uncreated spark, touching neither time nor flesh. He said it flows out of the Spirit and remains in the Spirit and is wholly spiritual. So now here, there's an important passage right after this that people have made a lot of. And it says, in this power, God is all at once verdant and blossoming in all the joy and glory that he is in himself. Verdant and blossoming. Okay, verdant. So I could have also translated this greening, that God is at once greening and blossoming and flowering. Well, clearly we're talking about plants, right? And that kind of thing is something that Eckhart does on a number of different occasions. But what's really salient and strange about this is that some of the people who had a lot of problems with the Inquisition, and I'm thinking in particular of Marguerite Porete here, who was actually burned at the stake during Eckhart's lifetime in 1310. And Eckhart, by the way, stayed at the house of her inquisitor in Paris a year after that. And so, once again, if you're worried about Eckhart being associated with the Brethren of the Free Spirit and the Beguines and those who were actually having problems with heresy with the church, I don't think he would have stayed at the house of her inquisitor who was responsible for, her being put to death for this same kind of thing. I mean, so anyway, there is a distance, I think, that we should notice between Eckhart and these others. But the reason that I mention that here is because greening is something that was actually a common metaphor among the female mystics of that time. Now, there was an entire study. In other words, there was a book-length collection of articles where people have been very high on trying to show that Eckhart actually had some influence from the female mystics of the time, and maybe even to show that what we love about Eckhart was actually taken from some of the female mystics. But I think Bernard McGinn's comment on this, and I want to echo and agree with McGinn in this way, is that these studies, even though people have tried very hard, have been inconclusive. And they have not managed to show, even though people were trying very hard to do so, because they were motivated to show that it was really the women back then and it was not Eckhart. And it seems fairly clear that that's not the case. That it was Eckhart, and that, maybe he liked this metaphor. Did he take that metaphor from them? Who knows? Maybe. He may have used it just simply because it was already something that they liked. Or he may have been the fountainhead for it. Maybe he was, one of the people who really popularized it. Who knows? At the very least, the studies were unable to show that Eckhart had any substantial direct influence from these female mystics. And so I come down on that side as well in saying that, yes, he has something in common with them. He was a part of the Cura Monialum, so he was a part of the care specifically of the nuns in the Dominican order, and he was ministering frequently to these nuns. And so a lot of these sermons are to the nuns. But it doesn't seem as though there was any kind of obvious influence the other way. It's very hard for us to substantiate that kind of thing, and there's no reason for us, even though people have been very motivated to do so. So anyway, I want to put that out there. And that may be worth dealing with, for instance, like some of Amy Hollywood's work and some of what Bernard McGinn has done there in that collection. It may be worth dealing with that in the future, but I feel that's only an issue because people wanted to make it an issue. So anyway, verdant and blossoming. So that's interesting, and that's why it's interesting. And so he says, this is a joy so incomprehensible, an abundance of which no one can speak. So we're already beyond words. We're already beyond what can be spoken, but there's this interesting kind of paradoxical juxtaposition between the speaking here and the speaking of the eternal word. And then, literally in the next sentence, he's talking about the eternal Father giving birth to the Son in his power ceaselessly. So he's talking about the eternal birth of the Word, juxtaposed, sandwiched right in with this. Okay. This power gives birth to the Son along with the Father. It is a co-worker with the Father and is one in this power with the Father. So the Father's power is one power with this, not a separate one. We are co-workers with God in being able to act with God's activity. So we're never separate from that. And then he will go on to talk about suffering and saying, look, if you suffered in your whole life, you suffered and you were not spiritually progressed, you were not enlightened, had not had any kind of beatific vision of God, but then you got a single glance of God and his power right before you passed away, it will have all been worth it. That joy is so great and everything is so great that it dwarfs everything possible temporally. So no matter how immense your suffering, the smallest glance of divine glory then washes away absolutely every conceivable, speck of importance with temporality. And so there is absolutely no comparing the two. And he's at pains to point this out. And of course, we want to think of someone like Job here in this context. And so he says, if God never then more gave him the kingdom of heaven, he would have already received so great a reward for all he suffered. in this eternal now, So same kind of thing. In other words, trying to really stretch that out and make it as extreme as possible, that this makes everything worth it. Even just a single glance at God, that makes everything worth it. Okay. And so this is to be alike, again, to return to that principle of likeness. And this is to be alike in God, and there is not more than one now. And so this is the notion of likeness. And when we hear likeness here, we should think of the image of. So the imago. So the imago Dei, imago Christi. So the image of God or the image of Christ. And that's the kind of thing that he has in mind here. And so likeness is couched in terms of this image of language. This goes all the way back to Plato. Plato talks about likeness and talks about the forms as likeness and all the manifestations as likeness to the forms. And then ultimately, famously in the Timaeus, which Eckhart would have known, that you have this notion of verisimilitude, in other words, the truth likeness, and that you have the likely story, that even if I can't tell you directly what's going on, I can give you a likely story that smacks of the truth. It at least has some likeness to truth. So even if I can't give you the truth directly, I can give you something that kind of smells like it or looks like it. And I say smell in particular, of course, because that's a powerful metaphor for Eckhart, but not necessarily Plato. So anyway, that's also in the background here with this talk of likeness. And then he goes on to make the theological point, which he has been kind of motivating in a very, graspable, experiential, sense to this point, in saying all things stand in God, all things stand in him in their essences. And so God receives nothing new from them, nor anything that happens. In other words, he wants to make very clear then that the theology has not changed. Everything in its essence stands in God, who is being itself, and nothing new comes to pass in God. God is unchanging. So the very idea of novelty is alien to God, as everything that is any kind of distinction is alien to at a distance from God. Okay. So he goes on to say there's another power that is incorporeal. It flows out of the Spirit and remains Spirit and is entirely spiritual. In this power, God is ceaselessly gleaming and burning with all of his riches. And so the burning heart of God, but also we should think perhaps in here of melting. Melting is another unusual, but an image that does come up for Eckhart. So it's not just a burning off of the desires, not just a burning away of that which is individual, but also a melting into God. And so that may be what is implied here. And he says specifically with all his sweetness and his delight. And so sweetness is specifically an experiential thing. Again, I mentioned taste, something that smacks of. Eckhart is very fond of taste metaphors. And I think personally, as a translator, it's really important to make sure that that isn't masked by translation. Because frequently people will translate these words and not give the actual sense of, I am tasting something. And so divine sweetness is an important experiential metaphor because it is the sort of thing that you cannot rationalize your way around. Like if you've experienced something, if you've experienced the taste of something, you can't question whether, did that actually taste like an orange? No, it just is. It is what it is. And so we can't question that in the same way that the taste of divine sweetness is such that we are meant to understand is directly experiential and cannot be questioned. And so it's that kind of thing that is meant even by that little word. So even just that little word, that little oblique reference here, Eckhart is being fully consistent because he says this elsewhere and also implying something that is really quite different than what it is that most people talk about in this way. So he is emphasizing, I have argued, experience. Okay. And so he says, truly in this power is so great a joy and an immeasurably great delight that you can't fully reveal or speak of it. Now, that's important because what I just said, you may have said, okay, you're making a lot of sweetness, but then in the very next sentence, he explains this. He loves doing this kind of stuff where Eckhart will refer to something or it's like maybe he's saying something. And then the very next sentence, he reframes it, says the same thing again and makes it super clear. And that's exactly what happens here is that he says, not only can you not speak of it, in other words, he already mentioned it as ineffable, but you can't reveal it. In other words, you can't get at this. You can't give this to anyone else. It's something that you must experience for yourself. You must reveal it for yourself, which, by the way, is wrapped up in the notion of truth as a revealing or an uncovering. That's the kind of thing that we get with Eckhart. There's also a sense of, there's a metaphorics of being bare, being nude. And he says specifically at one point that we catch God in his dressing room, his Clytus. And that's kind of interesting. So he's not shy about those metaphorics. That is the kind of thing that he has. That is the kind of thing that he has in mind here. And so he goes on and wraps this back to rationality and says, if there were a single man to rationally look herein and glimpse truth for a single moment, at the delight and joy that is in here, all that you can suffer, all that you could have suffered would be too little, and indeed nothing. In other words, it is driven down not only to be small, but to be dwarfed to the point of being completely invisible. And we should not miss the fact that this is presaging something of the infinitesimal. In other words, if you're thinking calculus, and maybe one or two of you out there thinking calculus, anyway, if you're thinking of the infinitesimal, then you might just be right in the sense that he is describing not just, in proportion, like I have a basket full of things and it's, full of beans or something and all of them are the same color except for one of them. It's like, well, that one of them is dwarfed compared to all of the others, but it's not dwarfed to the point of being nothing. It still has existence. It's still a bean that you can pick up. What Eckhart is talking about is a much more extreme form of this. This is something that he gets to with for instance, a drop of wine in the ocean. So a drop of wine that you drop into the ocean becomes literally as nothing, like it disperses and becomes incomprehensibly merged with the ocean. And so it becomes incomprehensibly, indistinctly one with the ocean. So that's pushing in the right direction. But this one arguably is even closer to the infinitesimal, even closer to calculus. And so the infinitesimal, if you're not familiar with this, is the idea of a quantity that is infinitesimally small. So something that is infinitely small, and you put infinite number of these together, then you get something that can be continuous. In other words, you start with pieces, and the usual way of describing this in calculus is like the area under the curve. And so you start with a bunch of boxes, but then if you approximate it with even more and more of these boxes, then you eventually get to a smooth surface. But you don't hit that with any finite number. You only get it with the infinite. You only cross over to the infinite and actually get a continuous surface, because obviously you never quite get there. That was the problem, by the way. And again, if you're thinking that I'm making this up, that was the problem, by the way, with the squaring of the circle. And that was something that was very current at this time. Eckhart would have been familiar with, and that was a big discussion of, okay, well, if I take a circle and I try and approximate it with a polygon, so I'm drawing little pieces of lines around it. Well, I mean, the more lines I use, the better I can approximate the circle. But they're wont to say, it's never a circle, no matter how many lines you use. If I use, a million lines, it's still a million lines. It's not a circle. But at the limit, and limit I'm referring to here specifically in calculus, at the limit, it becomes a circle. At the limit, it becomes a continuous thing. And so they're pushing in that direction. They're not quite there yet, but it's intellectually, it's in the air. And so that's something that we can see that's already happening even here. Okay, so it becomes as nothing. I mean, we're talking about God carrying your burden, and all of a sudden it, bleeds into calculus. That's kind of crazy, but it's not. So Eckhart says, even more so, and this is more of a prosaic point, it's not a burden for me to carry something if somebody else is lifting it. If God is carrying it for me, then even if somebody placed something big and heavy around my neck, if somebody else was carrying it, then it would be no burden. That's actually arguably the easiest thing in the entire sermon to understand. That's a very obvious and easy thing to understand. So it does me no harm because of that. And then he goes on and says, God makes it light and sweet for him. So he repeats the same word. In other words, it's still experiential. God makes it light and sweet for him. He changes the experience of that burden. And so he then wraps this back around to the beginning of the sermon, going into a little castle Jesus went into a little castle and was received by a virgin who was a wife. Okay. So he's now going to talk about the little castle. So he's talked about the notion of physical virginity. He's talked about the notion of spiritual virginity, and then giving birth to the word and the soul as the wifely activity in eternity. And now he says, I'm going to talk to you about the castle. And so once again, it's like, okay, we've already done so much, but there's more. And so he continues here and says, I've sometimes said there's a power in the spirit that is alone and free. He's begun 3 paragraphs like this. So this is the 3rd time that he has emphasized just this kind of thing, and says, I've sometimes said it's a guardian of the spirit or a light, or, and now he makes it explicit, I've sometimes said it is a spark. But I say now, in other words, I'm not just going to say it's a spark. I'm going to offer a correction. I'm going to offer some way of going beyond that, and says, I say now, it is neither this nor that. This is the hoc et hoc of his Latin works. And he's famous for this, for the Latin works of this or that. In other words, stuff like things in the world, anything that can be differentiated, anything that can be distinguished from another thing is a this or that, hoc et hoc. So it refers to just the stuff, the things of the world. And he says it is neither this nor that, and still it is a something. Okay, this is a difficult translational piece that gets glossed over, and unfortunately I know Miss Evans glosses over this or had a tough time with it, because Eckhart uses, the word is etwas. And so this is similar to the modern German etwas, right? So in the Middle High German, etwas, it means basically the same thing. So it refers to a something. Well, it is that something that Eckhart uses as a technical term. And I think that it's absolutely brilliant and wonderful that he does this. But it's really hard to see that it's happening. And linguistically, it can be very confusing. But he is saying it is a something. So the uncreated spark in the soul is a something. In other words, I don't want to give it a name. It is a je ne sais quoi. It is a something. It is a I know not what. And so he names it by not naming it. And I think we should appreciate the paradox of it being called a something, because there is a paradox that lays in that. It's higher above this than heaven is above earth. In other words, this is as exalted as it can be. And so this is the, I'm going to make this as extreme as I can. And I name it now in a nobler mode than I've ever named it. In other words, spark, yeah, that's good. People called things sparks before. That was a tradition that went back a long way. But he says, I'm just going to call it a something, and that is a nobler name. Now, you should notice the parallel structure here, because he does this with virgin and wife, in saying that wife is a nobler name than virgin for the soul and a nobler activity. And he says the same thing here. Spark is good. Spark is like virgin, but something, that's even better. Something is like wife. And so something is this nameless name that is the divine activity. And so there's something beautiful about that, right? Pun intended. And we should refer here or be thinking of Dionysius's divine names. And so Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, who was thought at the time to be an apostolic authority, but it was, by the way, during Eckhart's lifetime, right around this time, around 1280, where another Dominican, William of Morbecca, translated Proclus's Elements. And in translating Proclus's Elements, it became pretty clear that Proclus's Elements, which is this is hundreds of years after Christ. And Dionysius, whoever Dionysius was obviously making use of Proclus's Elements, which means that he couldn't possibly have been Dionysius the Areopagite, who Paul met on the way to Athens. And so he was thought of as an apostolic authority that went all the way back to the time of Christ, but in fact, it was later discovered that no, he was probably 5th or 6th century. Anyway, so that's what I'm referring to there with the divine names. So, okay, it is free of all names and naked of all forms. So again, this is the, blos. This is the naked, nude, denuded, completely stripped of all forms and names. And so just as it is, without any kind of clothing, any kind of hindrance to seeing what it actually is. And he goes on and reinforces that, yeah, this is actually what I mean by naked. In the sense that he says, once unhindered and free. So nakedness being unhindered, clothing being hindered. And he says, as God is unhindered and free in himself. So completely one and simple, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says again, in this same power I've spoken of, God is blossoming and verdant with all his Godhead. And spirit and God, and this, et cetera, et cetera. And so he goes on and says the same kind of thing several times. So blossoming and verdant again. So if there was any ambiguity, he does mean it to be greening freshly. And this is the sense of greening here, by the way, is just the ceaseless birth of the word. So the word is born in eternity. Being born in eternity means that it is born ceaselessly. The Word is being born constantly. So Christ is forever being born in the world by the Word, that the world itself is forever being born. And that's the sense in which we should understand greening. So everything is forever new because at every present moment, God is creating and speaking the Word. That's worth pausing to think about. Because normally we think in terms of memory and, past and future, and I've got all these conceptions and the objects have permanence and it's the same as it was. But it's interesting to stop and think of the possibility that, temporality, the way that we view past and present and future, is a kind of construction. It's a kind of illusion. And we know that our memories are constructions. We know that our notion of the future is very obviously a construction in imagination. But it's worth knowing as well that the present and the way that we tend to see the present is itself a construction. And if we were able to see things through the eyes of a child, and I'm thinking here in particular, of course, of the Zen concept of a beginner's mind. And so if we were able to see things afresh, completely unhindered, in other words, virginal, however you like the metaphorics, then we would be able to see things as God does in the originary power of giving birth to the Word all at once, everywhere at the same time. That's really a spectacular kind of image, I think, and that's what he's headed for here. Okay, so now, this is interesting, and this is one of the reasons that this is famous, arguably for the same reason that Sermon 52 is famous, because he says some really, really provocative stuff towards the end. And so he says, so the same sun and light and is the truth. We know that, not a big deal. That's a commonplace. If you could look upon this with my heart, you would understand well what I say, for it is true, and the truth itself speaks it. Wow. I mean, what a radical thing to say, right? That this isn't just me speaking. This isn't just Eckhart speaking. This is the truth itself speaking. So in other words, if you were able to look upon this with my heart, in other words, if you could see the world through Eckhart's eyes, if you could enter into his imaginative horizon, if you could see the world as he does, then you would see exactly what he's saying. And that this is true and the truth itself speaks it. In other words, this is divine. If you could see through Eckhart's eyes, you would see the divine. How in the world people see this kind of stuff and don't think that Eckhart is referring to experience? I just can't imagine. Stephen Katz argues this, and people in the Bochum famously have, opposed Eckhart as a mystic. I don't see how they could possibly maintain that. When he says something like this, if you could look upon this with my art, if you could see things as I see it, look upon this with my heart, you would understand well what I say, for it is true and the truth itself speaks it. How could that be anything other than experience? Now, see and listen well. That's beautiful, right? If you could see this, then you would understand it, for the truth speaks it. And then the very next sentence in the beginning of the paragraph says, now see and listen well. It's kind of a pun. So one and simple is this little castle above all modes, so above all possible ways of seeing things, experiencing things, of being. I say to you, and I mean in the soul, that this noble power I've spoken of is not even worthy to peer for a single moment in one glass, blah, 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 blah. So in other words, it's the same. And what he's going to say about the little castle is the same thing that he had just said about God, that it's not worthy of even one glance. Like you have to, even one glance is enough. That is enough to be able to understand the divine power. And he says, God is gleaming and burning with all his riches and with all his delight. It's almost the same sentence as what you get previously in the sermon. Eckhart is doing this intentionally. That structure is parallel for a reason. He's repeating himself rhetorically for a specific reason. So, and he goes on and says, it never dares to peer within. So truly one and simple is this little castle, above all modes and powers, etc., etc. And then he says, God himself never peers into it for a single moment and has never peered insofar as he possesses himself according to a mode and out of the attachment to his persons. So in other words, this is the rhetoric of God is like hurrying and is like dropping everything to give himself completely to the enlightened person, to the spiritual person, to the perfected individual, as Eckhart says it. And to the complete person. That's another way of saying it, right? So to someone who is complete and perfect and has attained this. And he says God rushes to give himself to this. And it's it's a funny image. It's an interesting image, but of course this is an instantaneous sort of thing in the sense that you have at that moment, all hindrance has been washed away. And so all impediment to understanding your being, which was there the whole time as divine, is washed away. And so you are simply divine. And, okay. So he says, and this is one of the provocative things that he likes to say, and this happens elsewhere. If God should ever peer into it, in other words, if God ever peers into anything of multiplicity, if God ever peers into anything of distinction and participates in any way in multiplicity, it must cost all his divine names an attachment to his persons. Divine names that, again, we should be thinking Dionysius. Eckhart certainly probably was, I would say, certainly was. An attachment to his person. So he said he must leave them all at once if he should ever peer inside. In other words, he would cease to be the oneness of God outside of multiplicity. And he says, insofar as he is a simple one without modes and attachment, there he is neither Father nor Son, no Holy Ghost in this sense, and is nevertheless a something that is neither this nor that. Do you see the parallel structure again? So he did it in several different ways. He says, if God were to look in, then he would have to look in with multiplicity. But outside of multiplicity, he is neither Father nor Son nor Holy Ghost. In other words, even the conception of the persons of the Trinity does not apply here. Even the conception of Christ, the conception of the Holy Ghost, God qua Father, so God as a Father, all of that is outside of and alien to this complete and utter divine oneness in the Godhead that he is trying to push for towards the end of the sermon. So we're reaching the climax, right? And he unifies and connects that with the something of the soul. And if there was any ambiguity, again, that is neither this nor that. Hook it, hook. So it's very clearly intentional, and it's very clearly parallel in terms of its structure. And once again, this can be masked by the translation. So if you don't translate it where these words are the same, then you might miss the fact that they are the same and that the structure is the same. So I think that's really important. And so he says, wrapping up the sermon, this is what I call the little castle in the soul. He doesn't come to it in any other way. So this is where, this is the way it has to happen. What I have said to you is true. I lay the truth before you with my as a testimony, with my soul as a pledge. So I have laid out the truth before you. The truth itself speaks it. I can't be any clearer than that. How much better can we possibly get than to have driven all the way to the Godhead and say God himself speaks it? What else can you do? And so that's it. That's the end of the sermon. We may be in a little castle which Jesus may go into and be received and eternally abide in divine rest and take as home. Abide in the way I've spoken of. May God help us to this. Amen. So now we're done. He's reached the climax, and wow. Okay. So I hope this helps. And I hope this is something more than just what can be some of the dry exegeses that you get with this. So I hope it helps you to understand what's going on in this, one of Eckhart's arguably most important and most interesting sermons.